love to color my world, and today I'm going to walk you through the final steps of putting together the Sunshine and Shadows Block of the Month quilt for Sit and Sew Fabrics. So instead of having the finished quilt behind me, I've got my blocks laid out with my sashing strips and squares so we can start putting these pieces together. And we're going to start out by following the assembly page in the pattern. Let's get started. So if we look at the blocks on the wall here, each row consists of 3 blocks and 2 gray sashing strips. And then we also have sashing rows, which are made up of 3 sashing strips and 2 yellow squares. And you can cut those yellow squares from any of your extra yellow from making all of the blocks. So we're going to start by assembling the block row and then the sashing row, and then we'll continue doing each of the rows until we've got all of our rows put together, and then we'll assemble the rows. So when I get to the assembly point of a quilt, I like to keep my pieces on my design wall because it helps keep them in the right order, and for blocks that have an orientation, it helps to keep them oriented in the right direction. So when you do bring blocks down to where you're going to pin and then sew, just double check against your pattern that you've got the pieces in the right order and the blocks in the right orientation. So I've got my first row sitting down here on my cutting table and my sashing strips between the blocks. And the sashing strips are cut to 12.5, which is the same size as your finished block. So what I'm going to do, and you can see here I've got a little bit of extra on this yellow piece that's not quite straight with the rest. So if you end up in a situation like that, all you need to do is trim it off. And what you can do before you even start is to go and measure all of your blocks and square them up to 12.5 inches. And that way you won't run into little things like that. So now I've got that edge straight, and what I'm going to do is I am going to pin my sashing strip to my block. And I'm going to pin at both ends first because I want the block and the sashing strip to be the same length, which is the 12.5. And then if for some reason my block was a little long or a little short, as I feed the fabric through my sewing machine, I can pull and push a little bit to adjust that. So I'm going to pin and stitch a sashing strip to that first block, and then also to the right hand side of my second block. And when you get to the blocks that have points, that you want to make sure that you get the point, what you can do is you can flip it over and sew from this side, so you can kind of guide where you're going. This block is not one of those, so we'll talk about that in a different one. So I'm going to start out by sewing these 2 strips on, and then we'll come back and continue putting the row together. So I've got my first 2 seams done, and you can press at this point if you want. Because we're working with such skinny strips, I'm going to wait till I have them all joined together, because a lot of time when you press a skinny strip, it makes the other edge of it just go a little wavy. So by sewing them all together first and pressing afterwards, I can avoid that happening. So what I'm going to do now is to fold this one over the top and then do the same thing where I'm going to align the top and bottom edges of the block with the top and bottom of my sashing, and then pin those spots. And if you want to pin more in the middle, you can do that as well if you'd prefer to have extra pins. And then right away while I'm here, I'm going to just fold this second sashing over. You can kind of give it a little finger press open. And I'm going to pin this last block in place as well. And then I can sew one and sew the other, and I'll come back and that entire block row will be assembled. So I've got all 3 blocks and 2 sashing strips assembled for the first row, and now it's time for pressing. Now the key with pressing is you want the seam allowances from your block rows to go opposite from your sashing row. So I'm going to press on the block rows, I'm going to press toward the sashing strips. And the reason I'm doing that is because here, the edges of the block is where all of my seams and my bulk are. And so if I'm not having to bend that back on itself, it just makes it a lot easier. So I will do that for each of them. Okay, then I'm going to take this row and put it back up. Beautiful. So next, we're going to do a sashing row. And all of these sashing rows will be exactly the same. So if you want to do them all at once, you can do that. But same thing, and you can choose where you want your different colored yellows to go. But where we're going to lay out, these won't all fit on my cutting table to see, but lay out sashing strip, square, sashing strip, square, sashing strip. So I'm going to do just like I did with the blocks and line those two up and pin. And the same with the next. And then join them all together like I did with the blocks. So here's my sashing strip, and to make my seam allowances go the opposite way of my block rows, I'm going to press away from my sashing squares. And since it's just these little tiny squares, it's pretty quick and easy to do those. And then that way my seams will nest when I go to join the rows together. Okay, let's put this back up. All right, so that's my first block row, my first sashing row. And I'm going to do the same thing with the rest of my block rows and the rest of my sashing rows. So this star block here is a good example of where I'm going to flip my block over so I can make sure that I'm keeping my points nice on the block. So I'm going to start out by just putting, just like I did before with the skinnier sashing strip on top, because then I can kind of control where it is and put a pin at the top and bottom. And then I'm going to flip it over and I'll put in a couple more pins right around where those points are. And then as I'm stitching down this line, if I need to, tweak my angle a tiny bit so that I run right into where those stitches intersect, I can do that to keep nice points. If you do flip it over like I did, you definitely want to add more pins because you can't always tell where the sashing strip is, and you can't hold on to it from underneath because it's so skinny. So if you put a couple more pins in, it helps hold that skinnier section in place. And then of course after you do sew it, you make sure you flip it over so that your pieces are still in your blocks are still in the right order for as you assemble things together. I've got the second block row done, and I went ahead and sewed the second sashing row as well. So let's just go over the pressing one more time. So for the block row, we're going to press toward our sashing strip. And because we're pressing toward the center of a skinny strip, I like to do one side at a time and then flip it over and do the other side. And you can kind of go down the middle and hit both sides at the same time. And do the same thing here. And then for our sashing row, we're going to press toward our gray sashing strip, so away from the yellow circle. And again, that allows us to nest seams when we assemble the block rows. So let's get these two back up on the wall. All right, we're halfway done with our quilt center assembly. we're going to do the same thing for rows 3 and 4 and for the last sashing row as well. I've got row 3 all stitched together. I'm going to add that back to my design wall. And then my sashing row as well. Okay, 1 row left. And finally, row 4. So now we have our 4 block rows and our 3 sashing rows all assembled, and it's time to start sewing our rows together. So we're getting close to having our quilt top done. I've got all of my rows pieced, and now we're going to start joining them. So I'm going to grab my first row and my first sashing row and start lining them up. Now make sure when you take them off of your design wall to pin together, just double check that you've got the rows facing in the right direction, the right orientation. You can compare them to the assembly diagram if you need to make sure it's all correct. So the key to making your blocks and sashing look great is a lot of careful pinning, and that will help all of your seams to meet, so your sashing squares and your blocks and your sashing strips are all aligned. Now, because we press the seams in opposite directions, they will nest together. So I'm going to start out by pinning around my sashing square, because that's where all our seams are, and then we will pin out to both sides. So for this first one, I'm going to make sure that my seams are nested with the excess going in opposite directions, and I'm going to put a pin directly after where those seams meet. And then even though it's really close, I'm going to do the same thing on this end because I want those joins to be as perfect as possible. And so now I'm going to do the same thing we did with the vertical sashing strips, and I'm going to align the end of my block and the end of my sashing strip, and that way if they aren't quite the same length, I can ease it to fit as I sew. So there's a lot to keep track of here because you want to make sure that your pieces all fit together, that your seams match, and that you sew straight. And because at this point we're sewing a lot of things with little pieces together, this is the area where you have the most opportunity to have things not go well. So I'm going to move along and add some pins to my second sashing square. I'm going to align my seam allowances so they're opposite each other, and put in pins directly after the seam, and then I'll go back to this sashing strip and add in a couple pins to secure that in place. And then same thing with this last little bit. I'm going to pin the end first and then add in a couple pins to hold everything together. So then to sew these together, we're just going to stitch with a 1/4 inch seam allowance the entire way down, and we'll have our first 2 rows joined together. I've got my first sashing strip sewn to my first block row, and similar to when we were adding the vertical sashing strips to the blocks, I'm going to wait to press until the end just so I don't make this edge a little bit skewed and wavy. So I'm going to continue in the same way, adding the sashing strips and the blocks together to get my quilt top assembled. So I've got my top all assembled here, you can see it, and I went ahead and pressed it because with these larger pieces I needed to go over to my big iron rather than the one that I keep on camera. So when you press the seams with your rows, you can press it in whatever direction you want, because now that these pieces are added, all we'll be putting on are the borders, so it doesn't matter which way you press. I pressed mine just like we did for the blocks and the sashing here. So I pressed toward the sashing on both sides just to help reduce bulk. So our last step for putting this quilt together is adding the borders. And when you add the borders, you're going to sew your strips together and then measure the length of your quilt top through the center and cut 2 strips to that length. And then when you go to pin them onto your quilt center, you want to do just like we did with the blocks and the sashing, where you pin the ends, and in this case, because it's longer, you can pin the center. Find the center of your border strip and the center of your quilt, which in this case would be right in the middle of the sashing, and pin that spot together too. And then you know that your border will fit nicely onto the length of your quilt. And after you have the 2 side borders added, you're going to add the top and bottom. So you'll measure across the quilt center plus the borders you've added, and then cut 2 border strips to that length. And in the same way, pin the ends, pin the center, and then stitch them to the top and bottom. And then your quilt top will be done. So when your quilt top is complete, you're almost done. What you need to do next is layer together your backing fabric, batting, and the quilt top. Baste those layers together, and then machine quilt or hand tie or hand quilt, whatever you'd like to do, your quilt top, and then use the included gray tonal fabric to add the binding. And then your Sunshine and Shadows quilt will be complete. So thank you for sewing along with me this past year. I've really enjoyed putting these blocks together and creating these tutorials for you, and I hope that you've enjoyed them as well, and hopefully learned a couple of tips and tricks and become a better stitcher through our 12 block sampler. So if you enjoyed our Sunshine and Shadows Block of the Month project, I encourage you to head over to sittandsewfabrics.com to check out the other kits that are available. You'll find both kits with all of the pieces pre-cut so you can start sewing right away, as well as kits made from yardage where you do the cutting and the sewing. And we just might have another Block of the Month coming up too. Great sewing with you.